contemplative spaces have almost always been about finding that space of inner freedom, but it's something that you really have to work to, especially in these complex institutions. You have to create them, and that to some extent means that can sometimes involve being quite brave.
Welcome to Chasing Good, a circle group podcast with the aim to help us better understand the good that's happening in the world today. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy. Hello and welcome back to Chasing Good. Here with me today, I have Cullan Joyce. Cullan, thank you so much for joining us, mate. Wonderful. Now, Cullan, as we like to do, just to kind of give our listeners a little bit of background as to yourself and what brings you here today. Can you give us a little bit of background? So, currently an Insight Fellow with University of Melbourne, working with Nicholas Van Dam, who's who's previously been with us on the podcast too. So, I'd love to understand a little bit as to your background, what's got you to where you are today, and then also a little bit around what it means to be an Insight Fellow and what are the kind of areas that you specialise in.
So thanks, Michael. I'm slightly unusual in the academic space insofar as the reason I'm working within the Contemplative Studies Centre is because of my long experience and exposure to contemplative traditions and practices. So after I left school, between kind of almost like a gap year, I'd spent a significant amount of time in Buddhist monasteries in Queensland and New South Wales, so still within Australia. And I'd also spent a significant amount of time within Christian contemplative communities, such as monastic settings in different places. So my background in terms of scholarship is there still, but within my work at the centre, a lot of my exposure to the contemplative traditions and practices, meditative traditions and practices, is really the reason why I'm at the centre. But I also had a lot of background in kind of working within the academic spaces and working between communities of practitioners and researchers and educational people. So I guess my role as an Insight Fellow is to kind of move between researchers, educators, the public, and also communities and policymakers, and kind of moving between those different groups. And a lot of that can involve I guess, program development and trying to make predictions about what the community needs are and how to meet those needs. And as well as, I guess, understanding how the complexities of the research and being able to translate those into various languages that fit the various communities or people I'm talking with. So it keeps me busy, but especially since the centre's been going for about 3 years, and we're one of the first of its type in Australia to look at contemplative practices and traditions. So the work that we've been doing has really been trying to focus on how we can contribute to, just improving Australian life in various ways. And so, yes, the complexity of my background is really helpful for us to be able to hone in on the different things that we need to do as we're trying to bring our work and research into engagement with the need of the public, I suppose.
Incredible. And what a fascinating background. So as you mentioned, the contemplative traditions, so Buddhist and Christian, kind of being heavily involved in those settings. That's a really fascinating piece, and something I'd like to, I suppose, explore a little bit more, because I would suggest a very small population, a very small percentage of people, or the population, get to kind of experience what it means to be more deeply embedded within those in kind of institutional or religious-based settings. And so I'm very curious to understand, I suppose, a little bit more about that. So could you walk us through your journey a little bit more? So what pushed you into those steps in the first place?
Well, I think one of the first things to acknowledge is that I had a difficult childhood. Like my parents divorced, and a couple of times, and so it's a pretty not an uncommon story to say, oh look, I was a little bit lost, 18, 19, 20, and I needed to find something I think that would work for me to help me, I guess, regain a sense of self and find a sense of who I am within the world and what I can contribute. I mean, I was brought up, had an amazing childhood in a lot of ways. I was exposed to art and all these different things, but it was a matter of going to the monasteries was also a place to I guess, to to see what I wanted to do with my life, and what I was, and it happened to be something I was also very interested in, and to some extent quite I learned very quickly. Um, I feel like the maybe a good way to understand the difference between how a kind of formal religious tradition approaches contemplative practice and as distinct from, say, an individual might, is that a monastery is a very, I guess, organized place. You have your timetable and the times that you wake up, the times that you practice. You might do some study, and then you might have work that you do each day. And you're part of a community of practice, and everyone's kind of working with one another. And so it's actually that's one of the reasons why it can be a place where people go to start to practice meditation, because it's fairly easy to do it in that setting, because you're constantly having prompts to help you to do that practice, depending on the type you choose. So when I was at first at a Buddhist monastery, a Tibetan Buddhist monastery in Udaloy on the Sunshine Coast, and I spent a couple of years there. And then I went down to New South Wales. It's a place called Wat Buddha, which is a Thai forest, part of the Thai forest tradition. Now, all of those have relatively similar approaches. The Tibetans spend more time in study, at least the Gelugpa, but the Thais spend a lot more time in meditation practice, so that was a much larger part. And the Christian approaches to practice emphasizes much more about rule and routine. So they don't necessarily have specific things that they do, that they might have singing or study, but it's often the focus of the Christian traditions tends to be about a timetable of what they call liturgy, or sung prayer, or various types of religious ceremonies and things. And it's the kind of timetable that carries the Christian monastic through the day, as distinct from, say, a personal practice. So they all have their own kind of slightly different approaches to it. And I found that coming out of that, as I started to practice as a person, without those types of structures, I find I still maintain a personal practice of mindfulness. But I also find I do enjoy spending time in communities, and I still have a connection with an interreligious community out in Healesville, I'm sorry, not Healesville, Warburton, in the Yarra Valley. And so what I find is that a community is a really good place to help to cultivate those practices, and gives you a bit of an energy and boost for when you go back to your own individual approach in your life. So I like to move between those two a bit, but I have found that I do prefer to I do spend quite a lot of time in my own personal practice and a lot of time in nature. But my kind of practice background was really embedded in those long time spent in those different communities of and monastic communities.
Interesting. And so you've effectively, well, I should say, those experiences have helped teach you the methods that best work for you, and help you understand, I guess, what understand the meaning that you can find within the practice for yourself, and then you've been able to tailor that to your own need in the everyday life, and you've been effectively moved on from those institutions per se, and have found your own practice. Now, interesting, the interreligion piece as well, I find to be a really quite a breath of fresh air, I suppose, when you hear about the individuals getting together to, I suppose, celebrate spirituality and the self. Can you explain that community to me, and how that works?
Yes. So you'll forgive me, but from the outside, interreligious dialogue and bringing people together of different traditions, it often sounds like the thing that they will be talking with among each other will be ideas or forms of practice. But in my experience, in most of these different communities, the shared bond, or the connection, has really been around quite the ability to just be with one another in a community space, in a community setting. So meals are really important. Conversation is really important, even if you're not talking about the actual kind of the different belief systems. So what we found, I think, and what I've working, is kind of spending time and living in an interreligious community, is that we found, I think the basis of the success of those traditions is friendship. And you need to be kind of able to get on well enough together that you put up with each other's foibles if someone's in the kitchen too long or doesn't do this or that. So I know that sounds really kind of domestic, but a lot of it's just the ability to the ability to meet as humans and connect with one another like that. And so that from that kind of connection and shared respect and you can start to talk about the different ideas that form the practice, like sometimes doctrinal, sometimes different approaches to meditation techniques. But in my experience, really, the heart of it is actually kind of, I guess, friendship sounds a bit trite, but it's really starts from that ability to be with one another.
Interesting. And well, I suppose you could say that that coexistence is the basis of family, effectively, could you? And which a lot of people might argue is the key to a successful community and therefore society and civilization in many ways. Is that something? Oh, okay. I'm curious now, if we look at those kind of belief sets and ideologies and the ability to coexist, does that then mean that these teachings are, well, fundamentally essential to a successful community, would you say?
Yes. I don't think beliefs are that important in some ways. Some of the beliefs that are important, in my opinion, are things like, well, how do I see you as a person? Do I like you enough to allow you to use the kitchen with me, and to give you that space, and will you do the same? I know that's really domestic, but it's like, can we share enough? Do we have enough respect to share a space? Like, I have a friend who's at the community, and he's kind of he comes from a very different background, and in a lot of ways we kind of clash in terms of when we start to talk about ideas, but we respect each other, and because we and a lot of it comes from my practice, and this is where the kind of formal practice intersects with life, is that I come out of a meditation, and I don't want to be disturbed. Maybe I want to keep that space for myself. But then when I go into a kitchen, I have to allow someone else into my space. And so when I was in the community, especially when I was spending significant time in the communities, my recent one too, the meditation didn't teach me as much as spending time with the other people in the community in the kitchen, and how it meant for me to have people come and go from that space. And when in a sense I wanted to control that space, but I can't. And so I think beliefs are important, but a lot of it really came, at least in my experience of my communities, is that just the ability to respect one another, and to hold that kind of respect and as really being the core of what of that supports every other thing that we might talk about or do. So even if we have conflict, and we often have conflict, it's really about, well, how do we where does that conflict fit in terms of our priorities, and is that conflict bad enough for us to for the relationship to be scarred or hurt? And usually what we would come back to is, no, we respect each other. And so it's a lot of it's just coming back to that kind of core sense. Family is a good point, but I think for me, because most of the time we're working with adults and living with adults and different men and women, but so don't have that intergenerational diversity that happens in a family. So I can't speak to that as much, but I feel like the kind of ability to tolerate each other in the setting is probably as important as any ideas.
If we were to look at then, I suppose, how we can leverage these individual lessons, and because from what we've spoken about, you've gone through quite a journey through institutional religions to along a pathway in towards a community-based interreligious communities, which is kind of helped you understand the ability to coexist, and which I'm sure you take those lessons into the research and study
Absolutely.
advice that you provide to the general public and to policymakers, etc. And so I'm curious to understand you how you take those lessons and then apply that at scale to a community, to a civilization. Can you walk us through? Do you have a process or a system that you were able to look at there?
Trial and error, but yeah.
Fair.
I think the biggest lessons for me, like I'd spent about 2 or 3 years in this group called Extinction Rebellion, which is a kind of an activist group, an environmental activist group, and I was doing the well-being a lot for them. And in those spaces where it's a kind of quite secular, but also open to different perspectives. But what I found consistently was that the most undervalued skill, but most important by almost by a mile, was the facilitation and the ability to let groups hold space for one another. That was really important. And so, in terms of the work that we do at the centre, and this is something is that mindfulness has a part of this, but the contemplative technique of mindfulness is just one part of a form of life, and a lot of what, in my experience, is really important for mental health and other things, and just interpersonal community well-being, is this ability to have a space where we can talk with one another and resolve our issues without it, kind of going into anything too heavy. And so, I think what it tempered in the work that I've done with the centre is just understanding that the setting, the communication, the facilitation, how groups hold one another, is as important as any of the contemplative techniques or reflections that gets done within those spaces. And really what it's meant is to try to take a lot of account of context as an important place that supports people to come to understanding if they using contemplative practices or whatever. But it's just really, for me, is to understand that there's actually a lot of different moving parts that help support a person and a group to feel good and to feel safe and to feel healthy. And it's just to see it really, that well-being requires a kind of a nest of things, like an interconnection of different factors that support it. And emphasizing one is okay, but it's really about, I think a lot of my experience suggests a balance between a number of different things is really important too.
And what would you say those factors are?
Oh, okay. So yeah, I think communities communication is a major one. So you have to have careful design to ensure that as you're going into these spaces, that people have clear expectations for what's happening in those spaces. And they have to, at different times too. I think it's also really important for communities within different settings to be able to exercise some autonomy. Maybe not over the totality of the space, but in different parts of it. So, for instance, when we were working within activist circles, we always had these things called group agreements, which were basically ethical agreements that we utilised so that we could talk about the respect that we would show with one another as we were communicating. We also had a kind of a capacity for co-design. I mean, it might not be too deep, but that can sometimes be like, okay, we're going to do this practice. Would anyone like to have some suggestions about how we do it? Sometimes autonomy there was really good. And the ability to, I guess, reflect on what was happening was also important. So that's, I guess, in the actual immediacy of the group. And we also had, of course, practices and ways of communicating that were calm and free of judgment, and allowed each person an opportunity to have an experience and express it in the way that they wished, even if they wanted to keep silent. But also, just so that's the actual group itself, but there's also significant elements outside of the groups that could also support it. Like, in my experience, we needed to have access, and maybe we weren't always utilising it, but we needed to have a process of potential referral. So if there was a conflict that did arise, we had a network that we could reach out to if we needed to bring in someone to support us with a conflict, or if someone is experiencing psychological distress, we had a network that we could bring in for, counsellors or psychologists. And I think so in that sense, the things that were immediate to the group, that supported the group, were a lot of to do with their group's ability to come together safely and to exercise and autonomy and express themselves in various different ways. But there were also things outside of the group that supported it too. So I know that's a little bit comprehensive, but that's kind of my thinking around the lessons there.
Well, because it is effectively community building, isn't it? Like we're talking about. Interestingly enough, these core factors that you've referenced, I would say could be core factors about any form of community building. They're almost correlating descriptions of what it means to be an effective community anywhere in the world, within a civilization, within an effective modern day civilization. That interesting now, based on that, because we've seen obviously what you've just described is a very how would you say? Well, it is basic, but I would say it's quite beautiful. It's in its design, in its consideration. What factors are we missing here? Obviously, we live in a much more complex civilization now. What's the difference between this basic design and our current landscape?
It's hard because I think a lot of it's case by case. Like I think that my experience coming through the activist spaces was that we had to start stuff from nothing. And so it gave me, starting from nothing, gave me the reflections of, okay, what are the fundamental things we need to have so that we're okay? But in most cases, you wouldn't be working from such a blank slate. You'd have a whole bunch of one thing, but you may not have another thing. So you might have really good buildings, and buildings are important. Remember that people have to gather somewhere, and you might have a good community, but they might not, for instance, have had much of an opportunity to talk through some of their personal or interpersonal issues. And so I think in some ways, like being able to be very discerning about where a community's at and what they might need to draw on to support themselves if they don't, to identify some of the things that they might lack that our intervention, so to speak, as contemplative researchers or practitioners might be able to support them with. So a lot of it, especially in cases of working in community, it's just about, a lot of it's kind of about noticing, well, what is it that can we do when we say, what is it that we can do to support a community to practice? It might just be like, oh, okay, look, you guys have got 4 out of the 5 things that you need. We can just help with this other thing. And so I think in terms of, I wouldn't want to speak too generally because there's a lot of factors that have changed recently, especially in community spaces and contemplative spaces, because the general, the decline of religion and all these things. And so I prefer to try to say, okay, instead of trying to say, well, what can we do to make our whole community better? I'd probably feel safer to talk about more in a case by case basis, because I do feel in some respects that as you go into conversations with different communities who you want to support to flourish, a lot of these communities bring in an enormous amount of experience and a wealth of capacity, but may not have been able to adapt to this and the enormous body of changes that have happened in such a short amount of time. And so I think that in my experience, especially working with communities quite a lot, is the ability to listen skillfully is probably really important. And the ability to work very much in a collaborative process and to try to find a way that there's a mutual kind of benefit from the conversation, I'd say. But I think that to some extent it's a bit case by case, but I will acknowledge that the changes of the societal and economic changes in the last 10 or 15 years have been dramatic and environmental, and they've changed many of the shapes of especially religious traditions. Can I just say one thing about so uh, when an organisation such as the Catholic Church is actually not a bad example. When an organisation of that scale comes under tension, so for sexual abuse and various other things have had a massive effect on the Catholic Church in Australia. What I noticed was when an organisation that was that large came under that much pressure, economic especially, it really limited its ability to make decisions. And the types of decisions that community would make ended up almost always, it identified what its core business was and basically eliminated the things that were peripheral to that core business. Now that doesn't sound very dramatic, but in a case of that, if you identify core business, and that could actually say affect, well, we're not going to do this other very significant thing that we have been doing for the last 30 years, but nevertheless does not represent for us an ongoing thing. So, for instance, the Catholic Church in Victoria and Australia withdrew a lot from schools and withdrew a lot from interreligious dialogue and withdrew a lot from ecumenism, which is the dialogue between different churches, because it identified its core business as being parishes, right? And that was mostly due to economic pressure. So what I'd suggest is that, like, the case-by-case thing is there, and we see this a bit as our institutions come under pressure. It's not to say that they're trying to make good decisions or bad decisions. It's just that it's very hard to make courageous decisions when you're trying to survive, or that they feel that's trying to survive. And so I did see that. I paid a lot of attention to that, seeing what was happening within the Catholic Church when it was coming under pressure from these factors. And it did surprise me that their response was not one of, I guess, of bravery or courage, but really was, boom, let's come down to what we say is core. And that was actually, to my mind, it didn't represent what the core of the religion is. But that's the call. And so I think as many different institutions in Australia come under pressure, it's going to be harder to do innovative things. And so I feel, for me, especially working within contemplative practices and spaces, well, most of my concern is to try to curate spaces or continually find spaces where it's possible to connect with yourself, and it's possible to make good decisions, even if they're brave. And so contemplative spaces have almost always been about, I guess, finding that space of inner freedom. But it's something that you really have to work to, especially in these complex institutions. You have to create them to some extent. And that to some extent means moving. That can sometimes involve being quite brave. So that's a bit of a long answer, but I do feel it's a very complex time to make these decisions at the moment.
One thing I also kind of note about the Catholic Church is obviously their influence. You mentioned the education piece, and I would say that that's a very significant part of their impact on communities in the way that they have, I suppose, grown throughout Western civilization. And I kind of, as one naturally does, I look at my own experience. And so I grew up, very Catholic. I was heavily involved in the church. Even I was a altar boy for 12 years. And I would consider myself agnostic now. I stepped away from that belief system during that evolution of that time with the church and how it was handled myself. And I think what I know now for myself is that I believed in God. That was a path that was effectively written for me from a young age. I had faith, and what I've found since then, growing into a man, and I suppose kind of stepping away from faith itself and the institution of religion, I've found it quite difficult to find that, or to bridge that gap of purpose, to find that meaning. But I've also found it easier in many ways, because I've already walked that path, to pursue spirituality and to find that, to explore different options, to explore meaning in different ways. And so whilst there has been a void that I have searched, and I actively do search to fill, I also find that there is a beautiful opportunity for me to lean on, where I understand what I'm looking for in many ways, because there is a profound beauty and peace to faith. There's no question about that. So one thing I note, and through conversations with Nicholas as well, it was the gap between faith and religious institution, and how that's happened, and then the increase in mental health, and you mentioned that, you've referenced that before too. But with the decline or the withdrawal of religious institutions in education systems, what does that mean then for the future? Is this something that you look at? And I suppose you yourself would have walked this path a little bit, kind of going through as you mentioned, look, embedding yourself within these institutions to find your own purpose. Do you think do you think my experience is one that's a little bit unique because I've had that experience in faith, or do you think is going to be harder for future generations to find their purpose through contemplative studies?
Yeah, I think your story is it's really great that you've been able to have that embedded connection within a tradition, because it is important, and it gives you a different sense of the world, even if some of it you don't kind of embrace anymore, or you can't. But I'd say, I mean, you might have a similar experience if you go to an Easter service. You might still find yourself connecting with that experience quite a bit, even if you don't want to. So, and I think it's because, yeah, you're right. There is still something there, and we're discerning people, and we don't kind of, although you're given it perhaps as a child too, there was something that resonated with you, and I think for me too, that's there, and there's a lot of, I mean, I have a lot of reasons to not like religion, from my own personal experience too, which I won't get into, but over time, and I think I've talked with Nicholas about this at the centre, regardless of how we think about Christianity, it's still the majority of people. Well, if you talk about say Buddhists, or non-religious people in Australia, is about 40%, but Christians still form a very large section of the Australian community, and what we've been experiencing in the last 20 years is something as a seismic shift. But in a lot of cases, the spaces, the sacred spaces, the spaces for contemplative practice that a person would want to go to, for the most part, would be either kind of peripheral, ashrams or temples or things. But a lot of the time it was the church. That was a space that was close by in the suburb that you could go and spend some time if you wanted to. You might go there for advice. And even if the advice was bad, it was something that often it was the first port of call. And I think, and another thing I'd say about this is that, I mean, with secular institutions, government, economic institutions, businesses, etc. Businesses, and they can say, we're trying to reconnect with our core values. These are our core values, and they might go back to that, but they get to set them themselves. For a Christian or a Catholic, like, yes, there's a terrible, if they do something bad, the model that they need to live up to is always Jesus, and Jesus was a pretty extraordinary person, and so, like, someone who was kind of a victim of colonial violence and did not, strike out in anger, is an extraordinary man. And so their model of reform at the end is still quite a radical model, whereas in a lot of cases, the the state or other businesses, they don't have to hold themselves to the same standards necessarily. So in some ways, I regret some of the things that the negativity I had towards religion, because I think in a sense that if you're asking a religion to change, the model of change to some extent was always quite radical. Buddha was a very radical person. Muhammad was very radical. Jesus was very radical. And so these having these spaces of potential radicality is a good thing, especially when we need to have when we might need radical to make radical decisions. But I must admit that in one side I don't always like religions, and I like having my own approach. But I also do wonder that the absence of these spaces, because they can draw on these core, good core things. I do worry about that a little bit, and so a lot of the work within the centre is to try to find ways to continually ensure that those spaces are available to people, even if they're not within strictly religious spaces, even if they're secular or interreligious. But it's to try to contemplative studies is a lot about trying to help people find those contemplative spaces, even if they don't associate with a traditional religion.
It's very fascinating to me the different ideologies that are set through from the different religious institutions, and you've just mentioned the different Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, as radical, which would in a modern day context is interesting to hear, because obviously these are individuals who large percentages of the population aspire to be or aspire to live by their morals or virtues. I am curious, I suppose, what you mean by radical, and I know this is a very tricky question because we've referenced three different individuals here, all for
Two of those.
yeah, fair. Can we talk to and I know obviously for yourself you specialise mostly in the Christian and Buddhist religions. Could you perhaps explain a brief snapshot about the individual? Let's start with maybe Jesus, if that's okay, and the core ideologies of good that this individual has been able to impart on civilization.
Yeah, well, Jesus was a very radical figure in his time. And remember that he was Jewish, but was rejected by the majority of his countrymen, for various people didn't believe. That's fine. But I think that his radicality was at the time where violence was a very viable way of expressing one's opposition to Roman occupation. The Jews were occupied, or Israel was under Roman Empire at the time. When violence was a very apt way to express that opposition, he said, no, we need to, love is important, and not just a love that's kind of it's a self-sacrificing kind of love, but also one that comes with a radical generosity and a commitment to healing of one another, even if you don't agree with their perspectives. Like famously, it's his interactions with non-Jews and with Romans and others was it seems very clear to say that he was willing to that he was actively hoping to be in a positive connection with people who he wouldn't naturally, within the culture of the time, he wouldn't have been expected to have those positive connections. He would have been expected to be angry and hate people, but he kind of made this fundamental commitment to love and healing that was expressed in very practical ways in healing and feeding the hungry. And I think that the radicality of that was that for whatever reason, he wasn't. That message was not only considered, not just wasn't just considered. Oh, okay, let's just let him be. But it was considered so problematic that that people decided he needed to be killed for it. And he wasn't really suggesting that the government be opposed or that the Roman Empire be overthrown. Really, that wasn't the core of what he was saying. It was really about the core of love and forgiveness, and still that, that for whatever reason that message was considered so radically bad or problematic that he needed to be killed for it. And so, in a sense, despite the fact that Jesus was arguing that yes, colonial violence and the violence of the state is a real problem, but we need to love and forgive one another and be in a healing relationship, that the state still killed him. And I think it's that radicality. I see it in kind of quite political terms now, because I think that and what came out of that, even Paul was extremely radical too. And it's really this kind of this core sense that really, Christianity at its core really is a very anti-authoritarian, anti-violence, anti-colonial, anti-power, or contrary to those different points. The fact that it's kind of emerged into into a much more of a state religion was completely impossible within its early foundations. Well, we talked a little bit about this too, but it was because of various different factors that led to it being the Roman state religion. But at its core, Christianity was a very, very radically anti-authoritarian religion in a lot of ways. And so it's kind of weird that it morphed into this very different form. But yeah, I think that maybe good to leave it there, and you can question. But yeah, it's been an odd evolution, really.
That's very fascinating to hear, and such a interesting point, because I feel the Catholic institution in itself, many might identify as the biggest and when one hears the word institution, I think a lot of people would probably think about the Catholic Church. It's become quite a defining institution, I suppose. Could we now then talk about Buddhism as a comparison? Because historically, I think there's potentially some comparisons that might be interesting to draw on there too.
Well, again, like Buddha was a really, I mean, it's been a while since I've done the full material, but again, Buddha was a really radical figure. He was a prince who was, would have, if he'd maintained his former form of life, he would have gone on to become a king. And he chose instead to be an ascetic, to be a renunciate, and to give up all his worldly possessions and status and go after to seek truth. And as he sought truth, he practiced in a way that was resonant with most of his compatriots, like some of the leading philosophers and ascetics and spiritual men of the time. He practiced with them. And he also undertook some very extreme forms of asceticism, where he was he starved himself, starved himself for quite a number of years in order to achieve a very deep meditative practice. And after a while, like when he comes across the middle way and starts to practice what's a form that is closer to a contemporary form of mindfulness or insight meditation, where it's much more about attending to your body's processes, what happens is that he achieves kind of his awakening, his Buddhahood, in a sense, which in a manner that is free from the kind of substantial theological commitments that many of his compatriots had at the time. So many of them argue, for instance, that there was such a thing as an Atma, as like a divinity, a divine self, or a divine being of some way, in some way that subsists or connects with me, that is part of my consciousness. And so that is a very strongly theologically grounded position that was underlying many of the people who he was practicing with. But he said, no, actually, that's not reality. The reality really is not. There's not that theological or divine process of self. It's really, my experience suggests that there's only my body and mind that I can see, and I don't see any. And the Buddha's saying, well, I don't see anything there that persists after my death. I mean, well, there's actually, I couldn't say that. There's a whole bunch of arguments, but he said that this divine self that was argued for doesn't really exist, and so to that extent he was radically contrarian, even though his form of life was very, very similar, and in fact basically identical to any of the other monastics or ascetics at the time. He's apart from the fact that he renounced his own position, but his philosophy, so to speak, was quite radically different than many of the his peers, and that placed him in sometimes in points of conflict with other people. And to that extent, I would regard him as being very radical. I think about the Buddha a lot. The Buddha's ends up coming to this position that says, if you pay attention to your life, if you pay attention to your body, your mind, your memories, your habits, and things like this, you can still become enlightened. You can still become free, but you don't find any of these large-scale theological principles that you might have been expecting. And to that extent, I think, well, he's a very brave figure. But in terms of what your own journey too, Michael, it says some of it, I think, speaks a lot to some of the experience that a lot of people who are having coming outside of very established experience of religious practices, theological practices, where we're asking, well, what is there? And the Buddha says, well, just look at your body, look at your experience, look at your mind, and try to find out. And so that's one of the reasons why I kind of, my practice now is in a sense much less theological. It's much more attentive to my own experience. So I do take a lot from the Buddha in that respect.
Incredible. It's interesting then to look at the comparisons, I suppose, of the civilizations that have been built historically off the back of these. The Christian-based faith is a fascinating one because, as you mentioned, you know, where it sits today isn't necessarily where it once, where the core ideologies kind of foresaw it shifting towards. Why is that, do you think?
Well, my assessment of this, as someone with, you know, quite a long history, you know, long approach to church history, is that during the period of the first century up to the 4th or 5th century, before Christianity became the state religion of Rome, the average church made a very strong commitment to caring for the vulnerable parts of the communities. Now, sometimes people think of that as a cynical process, that they were just evangelizing, but they weren't really. They were actually committed to, because the Christians weren't, the vulnerable weren't the ones who were becoming Christians. The Christians did their own thing often. But they were committed to serving the vulnerable within their community through food, through shelter, through a range of different things. And they are also substantially urban, centered in urban, you know, placed around large urban centers. They weren't, they're often in Rome and the large cities around in the Roman Empire. And over time, yes, there was occasionally some vigorous persecutions, but over time, the Christian church was a place within the Roman Empire where there was persistent support of the vulnerable within those communities. And my general feeling, and I don't know how, I know that maybe this has been talked about a little bit, but the general way of reading Constantine's conversion to Christianity, or the emergence of Christianity into the Roman Empire, is to say, well, they had the truest doctrine. I don't think it's that at all. I think it's got much more to do with the fact that the fundamental values and actions of the Christian churches were seemingly providing something for the Roman Empire that was sustaining their community, that was sustaining their cities in a way that the Roman state couldn't do. And so my feeling is that one of the reasons why the Christians became the predominant religion was not because of their doctrines or anything like that, but was because of how they were working within their world. And so I translate that now to, say, contemplative research and studies. Is that, so my feeling about this is that there is a good argument that religion and the good argument that contemplative practices need to express themselves in terms of, well, what is it that we are providing for communities? What is it that we are doing? So our explanations can't be purely spiritual, even if some aspects of our practice connect with the spirituality and religious experience. But really, the well-being or the interpersonal connection that comes with contemplative practice is an extremely powerful way of demonstrating the value of these things within the contemporary space. and it can be layered on any kind of religious perspective. So I do feel that I'm much of a pragmatist when it comes to arguing for why Christianity became the way it was, because it had nothing in its core suggested that it should ever be so closely related to the state. Never. But it became like that because of how it supported the state in a particular kind of way. It was almost accidental to history. So that, to me, it helps me to make some decisions about what I think will be important for contemplative studies going forward. We do have to contribute something. It's given me, my history background has given me some kind of lens for looking at today, I suppose.
Fascinating. And then, so I suppose the follow-up question, because that seems, we almost have I wouldn't say contradicting, but we have, if you compare the Buddhist and the Christian faiths, we have effectively an inward and an outward perception. And so would you then say that the Buddhist faith has allowed the individual more so to grow, and that has created a more organic following?
Sorry, excuse me. It's a hard question. I think that Buddhism is pretty conservative. Its monastic forms didn't change very dramatically, but there's, some big changes to Buddhism, at the different times of history. But it remained a fairly monastic setting, because, the core Buddha was a monastic, or Buddha was an ascetic. It's become, in the last 200 or 300 years, of course, there's very dynamic expressions of Buddhism in lay institutions and various other things. But the mindfulness revolution, so to speak, this kind of this is probably been one of the most dramatic revolutions in religious history that you could imagine, because really what happened is that people, within the West and various things, took what was essentially a practice done by a very small group of monastics, meditation, and said, okay, let's take this and identify what's going on in it, how it works, and let's start to apply it to various different settings, and see what it does. And I think the big insight, of course, was that, done well, mindfulness and, it's meditation, which is essentially a Buddhist meditation, can be very good for treating anxiety and depression, and helping people who have experiencing chronic pain. But again, this was started off as a practice that was done by a very small group of monastics, and there was nothing to suggest that it could be adapted to these other circumstances. It was just by, and it took John Kabat-Zinn and others about 30 years to demonstrate its clinical benefits. But I suppose in that sense you would call what happened within mindfulness to be a revolutionary shift in terms of how Buddhist practice has been done and how it's come out into the world. I think it's still evolving a bit. But yeah, I think that many, especially religious and monastic Buddhists, would say, well, mindfulness is not what we do exactly. So there's often a bit of tension that's come with that. But it's been an extraordinary shift in how some aspect of religious practice has been brought into the mainstream. And so sorry, does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, it does. It does also make me think as well, well, as you mentioned, kind of the contemplative practices and how you're able to apply this, because effectively what you're trying to do is how to simplify to the most core. It's a new ideology, isn't it? It's a new church in its own right, without calling it a church or defining. It's how do we support the individuals who don't identify with an institution or an ideology? How do we create spaces for individuals to pursue purpose, meaning for themselves, everywhere, without friction or judgment, or and how can we do that in the most effective way at scale? And so these are the kind of questions that you're really asking on a day to day. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, and so what an incredible life that is.
Well, took a lot of mistakes to get here, but it's pretty cool.
Yeah, mate, amazing. Good on you.
Look, I mean, that's the thing though. Um, Man, we've been through a lot in the last 10 to 15 years. Like I mean, if I'd come out when I started my doctorate, I just wanted to be a scholar. But yeah, look, there's a lot of stuff happening that we've needed to respond to. And I think that, from your description of your podcast too and what you want to do, it's like a lot of people who said, okay, we just thought that the world was going to be pretty stable and everything was going to be okay for a while. It's like, whoa, okay, that's not happening. And so my kind of reaction in the last 5 or 6 years is go, okay, I need to start asking a different question. I need to start asking how can I stabilize some of these factors and things that I just presume that will always be there, that are actually seem to me to be shaking at the moment. And so contemplative practices isn't, I mean, it's, the churches will always be bigger in Australia than contemplative practices. But my kind of emphasis and, in a sense, concern related to trying to get contemplative spaces out into the communities to try to find ways to hold people within this shifting and shaking that's happening. And I think that because there's numerous benefits to it in terms of mental health and well-being, but there's also spaces of potential creativity as well. But they can be very flexible. You can have contemplative practices, especially the way they can kind of lead you to say, well, let's meditate a little bit, or let's do some things, and let's try to solve a problem. There's also evidence that contemplative practices can support problem solving, can also help creative decision making and creativity. And so my general feeling is that the design of mindfulness, although initially it does look a little bit reductive, I actually do feel it has given us an opportunity to be very to be able to curate spaces quite skillfully in ways that we couldn't when it was within very restrictive forms of monastic expression. So the mindfulness approach, although yes, it's taken many things away, but it's also allowed us to ask questions like, well, how can we use this meditation to do a variety of different things that in the previous iterations we wouldn't have even thought were possible? So meditation just used to be used for mindfulness. Mental health and other types of benefits were just, meditation was used for enlightenment. The various mental health benefits were kind of subsidiary. Well, now we can ask, well, enlightenment, mental health, creativity, performance can get better too. It's actually opened up a variety of ways to express it. And I feel my own feeling is to create community resilience and to create these kind of spaces where people can kind of rediscover themselves and their health. But there's lots of different ways it could be used.
Cullan, what is good to you?
Mm. Yeah, it's a hard question. Mm. The world is good. Being human is good. Having consciousness, being alive, being able to experience what we experience. Being able to make things the way we do. It's like human life is amazing, but the natural world is incredible, and I just think it's like, to me, human life and the world, the environments, it's just sacred. It's just perfect. It's like we have this amazing experience, and we can do amazing things. I always think of the Large Hadron Collider or the James Webb telescopes. Look what we can do, and we have these traditions, and look what we can experience, and so we get to help things grow. We can plant stuff. Isn't this amazing? And I think that this is the reason why I get emotional when you ask it. Is that we're not doing very well at it at the moment. We've decided, I think not everyone, I don't think, but a lot of people have said, well, we think a lot of that stuff's optional. We think that maybe money is a bit more important than that. And we think that, and the way that we decide that we can get money is by committing acts of violence against the world. And I just don't understand it. So that's what worries me, is because we have a world and we have a life that's good, but we don't always act like that. I guess I know that's a little bit emotive.
No, it's a beautiful answer, and I think it's so important also to reference, the beauty balanced with the instability of human nature, whilst we have such a wonderful human experience in our most natural beings. That same human nature is also such a catastrophic thing. And finding that balance and creating systems to which we can exist peacefully, acknowledging both the balance of good and bad within ourselves and within the wider community and society and economy and civilization. It's a difficult world we live in, and there's a lot of work to do. Boy, is there some work to do.
Right about human nature is that it's come from somewhere. It's part of us. I mean, I didn't think it would get as bad, but it's part of us.
If you could make one change in the world, what would that be?
Well, I'll probably get rid of all the billionaires, I'm sorry. And I don't think they're doing us much good. And I mean, my partner's an economist, but I think, I don't think they're doing much good for us. And I think, unfortunately, the politicians too, like they haven't really. One of the problems with the difficulty around climate change is that the evidence is overwhelming and they're not listening. And so it concerns me that what happens when you have a fact that's kind of indisputable. We also have models for alternative economies and alternative ways, and it's like, and they're not doing anything. And it concerns me because they're weighing up, well, we think we're going to survive, but not everyone is going to have a good life. And I feel like that calculus is really cold. So I'm not too keen on billionaires or politicians. I mean, I know I've got to talk to it, but so I don't want to say I'd wipe them out, but geez, I don't know. Not too happy with it.
It's fascinating. I was actually having a conversation just this morning, talking to, I suppose, the distribution of wealth, opportunity, and education that kind of exist within capitalist situations. And I consider myself very much so I'm very, very much so pro-democracy, very much so pro-free market. I live in an environment where I'm able to build a business that I can give all my money away and try and shift or make change through that business. I think that's a beautiful freedom to have, and I revel in that. I also think that change is a difficult and scary thing for a lot of people, and any kind of major change has been rapidly followed by friction and conflict, sometimes major conflict, and finding that shift of how do we find a natural balance, a sustainable, natural, ongoing balance, is a question that that I spend a lot of time thinking about too. It's a tricky little world we live in, but there's a lot of incredibly bright people, incredibly good people doing a lot of good work for it. So it is exciting. Cullan, mate, this is all we have time for today, but I got to say, I have really, really, really enjoyed our conversation thoroughly. You've brought your journey is one of it's beautiful where you've gone in your pursuit of purpose for yourself and how you're able to then take that and now utilize that wisdom that you've brought for yourself and help others find that in themselves on the day-to-day is incredibly precious, and for you to share that wisdom with us today is ever greatly appreciated, mate. So I truly thank you. I thank you for your time. Thank you for what you do. We see you.
Thank you, Michael. And I'd just like to acknowledge that, for you, reaching out, but also the generosity of the way that you do your business and your work is really expressive of a lot of courage and great conviction that I think is really positive. And so, I'd just like to thank you for that, but also for how you bring yourself into the conversations to, express from your own experience some things that have resonated, that will really help me to feel able to talk in the way that I did. So thank you so much for that.
That's very kind of you, mate. Thank you most kindly. Thanks so much for listening to Chasing Good, a Circle Group podcast. Our mission is to shift the world closer to kindness, sustainability, awareness, and action. We hope you enjoyed. Until next time.